Good morning and welcome to my home. We are going to be getting ready for the day and talking about all things sourdough, so let's get to it. I do just want to add that I have this giant window at the front of my house that brings in the most beautiful sunlight, so it really does make for the perfect morning glow in the house. And I just love sunshine, especially here in Maine in the wintertime. It makes for a beautiful day. Right, let's go ahead and talk through sourdough. I'm going to give you some tips and some things that I've learned along the journey of learning about sourdough and baking bread, and it's hopefully going to really help as you're heading into this journey, because sometimes it can feel overwhelming as you're learning something new. But what I want to encourage you is that sourdough baking is actually not complicated at all. There's all these recipes online, all these people telling you this and that. And really, if you can just understand the overall concept of sourdough, it is much more relaxed than you would think, okay? You can make really beautiful loaves of bread, bagels, English muffins, pizza crust, all of that stuff, as long as you kind of understand these concepts, and you don't necessarily have to follow everything to a T. Okay, I'm gonna say it. I know that is like contradictory to what people say about baking, but I really don't always follow recipes to a T, and I always have a really good product in the end. So first things first is we are going to talk about sourdough starters. A starter is a mixture of flour and water that captures good bacteria and wild yeast. And then this is used to leaven or make your bread rise. And it also is used to help ferment your bread. So it breaks down the gluten in your bread. It creates all those really good bacteria that are beneficial to your gut and to your body. And it's really yummy. It creates that sour taste in your dough. And every time I think about a sourdough starter, it makes me I feel like I'm like, wow, God, how did you make this? This is so cool. It's like, makes me believe in the Lord even more because it's such an amazing process. So basically a couple of things about sourdough starter that will help you understand it so that you don't have to follow those super stressful sourdough starter recipes that have like 7 different steps to them. Because to be honest with you, I made this about 2 weeks ago because my sourdough starter got mold because I hadn't baked for a while, and I didn't want to follow a recipe online, so I just made it on my own without following a recipe, and it works beautifully. As you can see, it makes beautiful loaves of bread. I'm able to do this because I understand a few concepts about sourdough starters. The first thing to understand is that your sourdough starter, so all of those good bacteria and wild yeast in your mixture of flour and water, need flour and water to eat. So they literally eat flour. So one thing to remember when you are feeding your sourdough starter is that people often will tell you to discard some of your sourdough starter, and that is because you need to feed your sourdough starter more flour and water than the amount of sourdough starter that is currently in your jar. That is why you discard starter. So if you can understand that as you're making a sourdough starter, it's going to help you to not have to measure things out. You discard some of this. I like to leave just a thick coating on the jar, so I pour everything else out, and then I pour in flour and water and mix it up, and that feeds my sourdough starter beautifully. And remember that concept that you just want to feed your starter more flour and water than the amount of sourdough starter that's currently in your jar. Pretty easy, okay? All you're going to do is one day you're going to get a jar, you're going to get some flour, you're going to get some water, and you are going to pour it into this jar, mix it all up, and make a substance that is thicker, a little bit thicker than a pancake batter. I pour in enough flour and water to just like go a little bit up the bottom of the jar, maybe an inch or so. Maybe even less than that, honestly. So you're gonna mix that up, you're gonna close your jar, set it on your counter, wait 24 hours, and then you are going to do the same thing the next day. You're going to first discard your starter so that you have a thick coating in your jar, and then you're gonna pour in some more flour, a scoop of flour, a little bit of water, mix it up, try to get it to look like a thick pancake batter. Close it, let it sit for 24 hours, and then do the same thing again. So you're gonna do that for about a week, okay? You don't need to measure things out. You don't need to do it twice a day. And after a week, you're going to have a bubbly, beautiful sourdough starter that you can bake bread with. If you're using what I would recommend, which is 100% organic rye flour, it's not going to look exactly how you might think a sourdough starter will look, but you will see a bunch of bubbles all throughout the starter. It should rise a bit, and you can know that your sourdough starter is ready by scooping a bit of it out and plopping it into some water, and if it floats, it's ready to bake with. Now, my second tip is that if your sourdough starter doesn't look like those videos online, the huge, pillowy, fluffy sourdough starters that have like, you know, million of bubbles in them that like, I don't know. There's all these videos online, and I think people think that it has to look like that in order to bake a successful loaf of bread, and that is just not true. Especially if you are using an organic rye flour, it's not going to have that same elasticity that all-purpose white flour is going to have. But I find it's much easier to work with. It's still just as successful. So bake a humble loaf of bread with your sourdough starter, even if it doesn't look like a magazine-worthy sourdough starter, because it's still going to work, and that's the whole point of making sourdough, is making delicious bread that actually works and not necessarily something that looks like an Instagram, reel or whatever. The third point is that sourdough baking can be as simple as you want it to be, and it does not have to be complicated. You don't have to let sourdough baking consume your whole your whole entire day and all of your time. You literally can mix together your dough with flour, water, your starter, salt, mix it all together, and you don't need to necessarily even touch it again until you're ready to shape it and bake it the next day. There are things that you can do to improve the loaf of bread, like stretching and folding. And if that sounds complicated, just ignore the words stretch and fold and just focus on making your sourdough starter and then mixing together your dough, letting it sit overnight, and shaping it into a loaf in the morning. That's literally all you have to do in order to make a beautiful loaf of bread. And then if you want to kind of get more advanced or make your loaf of bread have more elasticity so it can kind of rise a little bit more, you can incorporate things like stretching and folding, which basically just works the gluten in the dough to make a stronger bread. Going along with this, number 4 is that you don't have to take 2 days off of work in order to bake your sourdough bread. You can really make this all work for you and your schedule and your routine. You don't need to take time off. You don't need to just make a whole weekend event of it. You really can make it work to you and your schedule. And just remember, once you get through the initial learning process, it's going to get easier. It's going to get much easier. Number 5, my piece of advice is you can start baking things other than a loaf of bread at first if you want to kind of get your feet wet, but the thought of making a loaf of bread scares you. You could make something like bagels, you could make English muffins, you could make tortillas. All of those things have a little bit less, I don't know, they're just a little bit less daunting. They're a little bit easier to make. Don't feel like you have to, once you've made your sourdough starter, you have to make that loaf of bread to start off with. You can do some other things that are really super, super easy to do. So I think you should just give it a try. Try to really think about this process having more of guidelines rather than recipes that you have to follow to the T. And I think that will help you feel a little bit more ownership. I know it helped me feel just more ownership over the process of not being stressed out if I didn't put the perfect amount of flour in my dough. Like, it always turns out delicious. So this way of approaching baking sourdough and cooking in general allows you to be less stressed about it because you learn the underlying concepts and then you can kind of go from there. A quick summary, and you just need to remember to feed your sourdough starter more flour and water than what is currently in the jar, and you want to create it to be a thick pancake batter-like mixture. 2 is that your sourdough starter doesn't need to look like the Instagram sourdough starters. It can look humble as long as it has bubbles and rises a little bit and floats in water. You are going to be a-okay to build your sourdough loaf. Number 3 is that you don't need to let sourdough baking consume all of your time. You can work it to your schedule and you can keep it simple. Number 4 is that you can make your sourdough dough and store it in your fridge and bake it whenever you want to. So that can alleviate some stress for you as well. And then number 5 is that you don't have to start off with a full-on sourdough loaf. You can start with bagels, English muffins, tortillas, things like that. I hope this was helpful. If you want me to kind of talk about this a little bit more or break things down a little bit longer on certain things, please let me know in the comments. Don't forget, I post a new video every week, so like and subscribe to my channel and let me know any other videos you would like to see. So good luck sourdough baking. You're going to do great. You can do it.